The last chapter of the last day is on web components. So probably the best way to start out with web components is just to show you a web component. So let's start out just by demonstrating one. Pull this up. And I've got just a very simple web component here called states. And you'll see why it's called states here in just a sec. Let me execute that. Drag it over where you can see it. So here's a very simple web component that's a map of the United States. Web components, you can think of them as reusable widgets that you can just kind of plug in to your program and use them as they are. And this one comes with a set of files. It has an image file that you see here. It has what they call an interface script, which is written in HTML that has some embedded JavaScript in it. And you also create, of course, a form file for your VDL program that integrates this web component graphic into it. So it sounds very complicated, but we'll break it down piece by piece, and you'll see it's not nearly as complicated as it sounds. So here's a web component that I'm running here on the screen, and in my VDL program, the VDL program is just sitting there waiting for some user interaction with this web component. Specifically, it's waiting for me to click on a state in the web component form item. So I'm going to click on Oklahoma. Now the web component picked up the idea that I was clicking. There's actually what they call an event attribute that's attached to the web component that detected that I clicked. And when I clicked on it, the web component in turn turned around and notified the VDL programmer, communicated with the VDL program that I had clicked on an area of the map. The web component retrieved information about that area of the map and then passed it to my VDL program. My VDL program took that information, which was just the state that I had clicked on, and it ran another function to go out and retrieve the capital of the state that I clicked on, which happens to be Oklahoma City, and the largest city of that state, which was also Oklahoma City, and just displayed those as form items as well. So a very simple web component, but it has all the pieces and parts so that I can show you how it works and how to integrate it so that it works with your VDL program. One second. I had some background noise there I needed to turn off. All right, so I'm going to close this, and we'll take a look briefly at the slides, the PowerPoint slides that I put together for web components, and then we'll go back and look in detail at that sample web component that we just saw previously. Get familiar with my interface again. All right, so by the end of the web component chapter, you'll be able to describe the benefits of integrating web components into your application, your VDL application. You'll be able to implement a web component interface script, which is the part that actually is allowing communication between your VDL program and the web component itself. So they refer to that as an interface script. It's written in HTML. Define a web component field item in a form file. And you'll also know how to use a web component in the dialog of your program. Typically, it's integrated with an input statement. That's the way this one works, in fact, is with an input. So a description of web components, you can consider them specs that are used by web developers to build widget templates that can be reused easily and reliably. So you could actually create a library of web components that you use with multiple programs. And all you would have to do is do the steps that we're going to talk about in this chapter to integrate the interface script, any image files, and a form that you can create into whatever program that you want to use the web component with. So once you've set it up once, it would be fairly simple to use it in different programs or integrate it with different VDL programs. So it's common to use these web components to create some more exciting graphical interface with your VDL program. So a lot of times the web components that people are looking or have to do with nicer charts and graphics for reports and whatnot, calendar widgets, drawing widgets. Mainly, people are after the graphical capabilities of web components. So to integrate a web component, there's only a few steps. The programming steps involved, once you've gathered up all the files that are associated with a web component, HTML, there might be a separate JavaScript file. Typically there will be an image file like the one we had for our United States map that we saw a second ago. So you get your files together, and the first step would be to implement the interface script on the front end. So that interface script, the HTML script, actually has to be deployed on the front end. Create the form specification file. Essentially you have your form file, and you will create an area on the form file for the display of the web component widget. So it's a special type of widget. The web component item type has been specifically created so that you could integrate these web components into your form file. And then once you have your form file created and your interface script in a known location on your front end, then you're ready to actually use that web component in the dialog of your program. And you use the web component field that you've set up in your form file just like you do any other regular edit fields in your form. Types of web components that we're looking at today are sometimes referred to as GICAPI web components. There's two types of web components floating around out there right now. The GICAPI web component that we'll be looking at today, and there's also something referred to as a URL-based web component. They're actually simpler to work with and simpler to program, but they're implemented in the next version of VDLs. So in our next version of Studio, you should be able to work with these URL web-based components. For right now, we're working with the GICAPI web components, and the GICAPI web components rely on this GICAPI global object. And this GICAPI global object has defined methods in it that allow communication back and forth. So there's some methods associated with this GICAPI object that are used for transmitting data or requests from the web component to your VDL program. And then there's other object methods that are associated with transmitting data or events from the VDL program back to the web component. So there's this back and forth communication between the interface, the HTML and the JavaScript, and the VDL program. So that's the job of this interface script. So the methods for these GICAPI objects that we use to be able to communicate between the web component and the VDL program, going from the web component to the VDL program, that direction, is set data, the first method that you see here. Let me grab a highlighter for a second so you can see. Set data. And you can see here that what this does is actually, let's say, for example, we were working with that United States map that we saw a minute ago, and I clicked on a state, and this set data method would be used by the web component to pass information about the state that I selected back to the VDL program. So that's the reason that we would use the set data method in the web component we just looked at. We also have a set focus GICAPI object method that's used for the web component to generate a focus change request back to the VDL program and the runtime system to set the focus on the web component that's on the screen. And then there's an action event here that the GICAPI object method can actually trigger, and that in turn raises an action for your VDL program. So in your VDL program, you can have an on input statement that has on action, and let's say the action is state, for example. This GICAPI method will raise that action so that the BDL program actually has the on-action state triggered. And then you would just execute any additional code in your BDL program that you wanted to execute whenever the action was raised. So here's some excerpts from the actual interface script, the HTML script that we've been talking about. And then down here at the bottom is excerpts, just a small excerpt from the BDL program for that United States map example we saw a minute ago. So right here is a function, or a method, excuse me, GICAPI event handler in the program that I'll show you a bit later actually fires when a user clicks on the map. And when it fires, it goes ahead and triggers or executes this function, this exec action function. And this exec action function uses this set data method that we just talked about to pass the name of the state that the user selected back to the BDL program so that the BDL program can do something with that, display it, for example. And at the same time, this exec action function also triggers this action called state. So again, in the BDL program, when that action gets raised or triggered, the BDL program will execute the on-action state code that you have in the BDL program. So here's our input by name, our dialog that we're using to interact with the web component. And the input by name is naming a form element called selected state. And that selected state form item is just our web component widget that we've added to the form. And again, I'll show you all of these things when we finish going through the PowerPoints. So pretty straightforward. Once you get an idea how they work, you can see the back and forth communication that's done by these different methods, these different GICAPI object methods. So here's some additional object methods that are used to transmit data or communicate back from the BDL program to the web component. And one thing I should probably mention here is that not every web component uses every one of these methods that we're looking at. These are just standard GICAPI object methods that you can use or can be used with web components, but they're not obligatory, right? They're not all obligatory or mandatory. So some web components may use all of these different methods, and some web components may just use a few of them. For example, not every web component has properties. So for example, this GICAPI method on property would not be used by a web component that didn't have any established properties. But here's some object methods from going from the BDL program back to the web component. Here's the onFocus method that gets called when the BDL program or the runtime system has set the focus in or out for a web component. Typically you'll see that when you first click on the screen when the form gets displayed. You'll see that onFocus will be triggered or called at that point. Then we have this onData that gets transmitted back to the web component when a form field value changes and gets detected by the BDL program. And then when a property of a web component gets changed, for example, with the United States map, there's a property for the title. And you can allow the user to change the title. And when a user changes the title, this onProperty method gets invoked so that the web component can change the name of the title, the property, the title in the title property. That didn't come out quite right. So in any case, you'll be able to see the onProperty method used with this web component. So to define the form file, one of the prerequisites is to create a form file that has this special web component item type built into it. So this example is a .per, the old type of form file. I thought you'd be able to see it better because it's all just right here on the screen as opposed to having to look at properties and whatnot with Form Designer. So it makes it easy to see this way. So here's our form. And then right here is our web component widget selected state. So we're just drawing an area there where this web component will be integrated into the form. And it's just a regular edit field named selected state. So right down here are some special attributes just for web components or web component widgets. And here we've got the name of the web component. So it's actually referred to as kind of the web component item type. Almost all the web components would be defined as form only. Typically when you get them, they're used as is. They're not typically stored in a database. So all the ones that I've worked with have been defined as form only fields like this one you see here. Most of the time they're graphical and you want the user to be able to resize them, so it's common to have this stretch attribute associated with the web component so that the user can resize the screen or resize the web component in the form. And then here's our component type. Now this particular attribute for the web component is really important that you name it correctly because it's providing a map back to the interface script, the HTML that we talked about earlier. So the component type has to be the same name as the name of the interface script. So that's how it knows which interface script to use for the web component. So this maps back to the interface script. So out there somewhere there's an interface script called map.html. And then if a web component has properties, then you have the properties defined in your form file as well, in the properties attribute. This web component only has one property, and that's the title associated with the web component. If you want to use Form Designer, instead of creating just a simple .per file, you can use Form Designer to integrate your web component, but there's a prerequisite of configuring what's called a .wc settings file. You can see from the example here that it's an XML file, and the contents of this XML file are all the properties and a description of the properties for the web component that you're going to define in the form file. So that's a prerequisite. So one of the things you'll need to do to use Form Designer is create this .wc settings file, and it's associated with the name of the web component. So this one in the example is called chart.wc settings for the chart web component. And it has all the possible properties for that web component defined here so that in Form Designer, those properties will be inherited for the web component widget that you're working with, and you can set those properties the way you want them in Form Designer in the properties view. So that's the purpose of this WC settings file, to integrate the properties into Form Designer so you can set them there. Now if you do use web components and the .wc settings with Form Designer, one of the things you'll need to do is set a special environment variable. There's a special environment set for this, just for Form Designer, called the Web Components environment set that you can see here. And then you click on the GSTWC_dir environment variable over here in the environment variables pane, and you need to set that to the location where you've stored these .wc settings file. So the rule of thumb, of course, would be if you use multiple web components, you would put all of your .wc settings files that have your Form Designer properties defined in them, and you'd put them in one directory all together, and then you would set this GSTWC_dir to that directory, like we see here. And then you would just save it, and from that point when you were working in Form Designer, you would be able to select this particular web component type from a drop-down list in Form Designer. I think I have a screenshot of that here in just a moment so that you can see where you can actually select the web component type then. So here is This is the same thing actually that we looked at on the previous page, but I left this page in, so I'm going to pop back for just a minute. Here it's saying make your web components available to Form Designer, and this is the method you would use for Genero Studio 2.50 and above. So we go to Tools, Configurations, we look for Web Components Environment Set, we click on GST WCDIR environment variable and set the path to the location where we've stored all of these .wc settings files. If you have an older version that you're working with, anything older than 250, so 240 for example, this is the method that you use to make your web components available in Form Designer. Slightly different. You still need your .wc settings files with your form properties or your web component properties for your form to inherit. You still save all these .wc settings files to the same directory, but instead of setting them in your configurations, as we saw for 250 and above, you go to Tools, Preferences, and in Tools Preferences, there's Form Designer Preferences, Form Element Settings, and then finally Web Component Settings. So you just specify the path for all of your .wc settings files right here in Tools Preferences for Form Designer instead of setting it in your Genero configurations area. So slightly different, just depending on the version of Genero Studio that you have installed. So that's why there's two pages on the same things. So once you've configured your .wc settings file and once you've configured your environment for Form Designer to be able to locate those .wc settings files with one of those methods, the next step is just to add a web component widget to your form file. So here in Form Designer, you can do it a couple of different ways. You can go into Widget in the toolbar menu and say, or in the menu or toolbar and say Widget Web Component to add the widget to the form. Or you can go in and just draw the web component widget in and convert it to a web component widget from some other edit field or whatever type you have defined. So it doesn't matter which way you set it up. Here it's kind of showing you both methods. Here's widget web component. Once you click on that, just draw it into your form file where you want it in Form Designer. And then right down here in your properties view for Form Designer, you scroll down to Web Component and then look for the Component Type property. And then right here is your drop-down where you would specify the type of web component that you're trying to specify. So this one's called Chart. Now it's getting those directly from the .wc settings file that it's finding out there in that directory. So if you have 3 or 4 different .wc setting files, all 3 of those will show up here in this drop-down list for component type. So that's all it's doing. It's looking for files, the name .wc settings. And then it's going to pull all those properties into Form Designer from those files. So the last step, we talked about the interface script and making sure you have that deployed on the front end. We talked about adding a web component widget to the form file. And then the last step is to actually use the web component in your BDL programs. So that's what we see here. They're typically invoked or integrated with a dialog, and it's typically an input like we see here. So when we start this program, it essentially opens a window, opens the form that we saw with the United States map in this example, and then it goes down to the dialog statement and it stops, and there it's just waiting for the user to interact with the web component so that we're doing this input by name. So the input by name is the web component that we've specified in our form file. Selected state, so here it is in our .per file that we looked at a few moments ago. And then also in our .per file, the component type is pointing to the interface script, the HTML script that's out there with the same name as the component type. So that's how the two are linked together. So anytime somebody is interacting with this web component in the form, it's also interacting with this specific script, this map.html. The directory structure is important because it has to be able to find the image files and, of course, the script that we're talking to with the BDL program. So something else you have to do is make sure you put the interface script and any other files that are needed by the web component. For example, the JavaScript might be in a separate file of its own. The image file will be a separate file. Those need to be in a known location so that Genero can find them. So with the application server, if you're working with the application server, the web component, the web component entry in the configuration file for the application server called as.xcf determines the path that you need to use to put your web component files. Everything except the form file should go here. So here's our interface script called map.html, and then here's the image file that we're using for our United States map web component. Now for the desktop client, if you're working with GDC, you can specify the location for your web component files a couple of different ways. The standard way is to store it in a known location that Genero will be looking for, or the desktop client's looking for, your GDC, your desktop client installation directory /web components. So that's where it's going to expect to find them. So right underneath this web components directory, you're going to create an additional directory for each web component called map, and then underneath the map directory will be all the files associated with that web component except for the form files, which you can put somewhere else. Now for only the desktop client, you can also specify your path with a front call method. Now you can't do this for the application server, for the web client. You also can't use this method if you're using the desktop client if it's attached to an application server, or if it's being run by an application server, connected to an application server. But here's this front call method if you're working with the desktop client connected directly to the runtime system. You can use this front call method to specify a path for your interface files and your image files. For debugging web components, there's 2 or 3 methods that you can use, and sometimes it requires all 3 methods. For one thing, you can use our standard Genero Studio graphical debugger if you're having issues with the BDL program piece of your web component integration. Right, so you can use that to debug the BDL program. Sometimes to debug a web component, you might want to actually use the Genero desktop client just because it has a really nifty web component debugger built into it. So it makes it very easy to see what's going on between the web component and the desktop client. And I'll show you that here in just a minute. So even if you're planning on using the web client, for example, to work with the application, you might switch over to the desktop client just for debugging purposes at some point if you're having issues with the web component. It has a really nice tool. And then once you get into debugging the interface script, which is your HTML and your JavaScript pieces of your web component integration, you're going to be using third-party or browser tools. For example, Mozilla Firebug has a JavaScript debugger that has features very similar to our Genero Studio graphical debugger, so that you can step through the program step by step, see the contents of variables, change the contents of variables to manipulate what the program does, and so on, just like we can do with our graphical debugger for Studio. So 2 or 3 different tools that you may end up using to debug a web component. Now here's debugging with the Genero desktop client. So the desktop client has an actual debug console that you can open up and show while you're running a web component, an application that's interacting with a web component. Now to be able to use the debug console, there's a few things you have to check first, and one thing that has to be set is the debug option with the desktop client. So right down here, when you look at your desktop client configuration, there's some GDC options. The -A, I believe, stands for administrative mode or admin mode. The -D, the capital D, is what we need for debug mode. So that has to be set to be able to use this debug console that we're going to look at. So right here is what the console looks like. I'll show you another look at it here in just a second. But these are color-coded entries. You actually have this running while you're running the web component or trying to work with the web component. And it's going to display color-coded messages that are color-coded according to who's talking. Right? So if it's the runtime system talking to the desktop client, you can see that it's going to be in black. The program to web component interaction is going to be in purple or violet or pink, whatever you want to call this color. So it's the interaction going back and forth between the program and the web component. And then eventually you may see additional info like timeouts, for example, that you see here, that's not really associated with the communication from the web component to the BDL program or the BDL program to the runtime system, but it's additional information like this ping timeout, for example. Nobody's done anything for a while and it's telling you that there's some timeouts. There's also some blue that you may see when you're monitoring the debug console like this, and if you see some blue text, it's from the GDC back to the runtime system. So in black is the runtime system speaking to the desktop client, and if it's blue, it's going the other way. So a couple of settings here with our desktop client. You want to make sure that you have this Enable Web Component Debugger checkbox selected. Make sure in this Display Messages About area that you have Web Container selected. And then to be able to see the console, like we see over here on the right with all these color-coded messages, you click the Show up here under Console. So that's how you can monitor what's going on between the BDL program and the web component and the BDL program and the runtime system in the Genero desktop client. Very useful for seeing what's happening, and when things go wrong, you can see what happened right before it went wrong. All right, so that's all the PowerPoint slides, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll make this as quick as I can and still feel like I'm showing you how everything works. Here is, I've just loaded all of these web component files into a studio project so that you can see them easily and I can run them from here. So here is my web component map.4gl. So here's our 4GL program. So when this web component application, or this application that has a web component integrated with it, kicks off, it's going to be starting everything off by opening a window with this web component map form that we saw in the PowerPoints, and then it's going to sit here at this dialog statement and wait for some interaction from the user with the web component. So right here in the dialog, it's going to be sitting here with this input by name, waiting for the user to interact with the web component displayed on the form. So if I run this guy, go ahead and execute it again. So right there's where we're sitting. When this appears on the screen, we're sitting here in this dialog statement at this input by name. Now when I click on an area of the map, of course I'm inputting into this web component edit field, this selected state widget that I have drawn into my form. So I'm going to click on, we'll click on Texas here. And when I did that, we can't see it here because I'm not in debug mode or anything of that sort. When I clicked on that, there's an area of the interface script. Let me pull this out of the way. So when I clicked on that area of the map, it invoked the interface script called map.html. Let me scroll down here into this map.html, and when I clicked on an area of the map, I was in this part of this HTML clicking inside one of these different areas of coordinates. So if I clicked on Texas, let's see, where's Texas? There it is. Okay, it took me a while to find Texas. So if I clicked on the area of the map with the coordinates for Texas, notice this on-click. On-click equal exec action Texas. That on-click is what I call an event attribute that's attached to this web component element, right? So it's attached to it. So when a user clicks on this area of the web component with these coordinates, it's going to fire this on-click. It's kind of an event handler, and when it gets invoked, it's going to kick off this exec action function that's in our interface script, and it's going to pass it Texas as a parameter. So if I go up here, I should be able to find this onExec function. Here it is up here at the top, or excuse me, this exec action function. So exec action equals function. We're passing in the state name. So here's one of these GICAPI methods we talked about earlier. The set data is going to pass data or information back to our BDL program. It's going to pass this back, in this case, the state name, Texas, and at the same time, it's going to raise an action. GICAPI.action raises an action called state. So when that happens, back here in my 4GL program, we're sitting here in this input statement waiting on the user to click on a state. The user clicks, that invokes this exec action. It raised an action called state, and now my program, my BDL program, takes over again and displays the selected state to the form, to the state name field on the form, and then it calls a function called initData and passes Texas, the selected state, to this function. I hope I said function. And then down here is our initData function that gets called, passes in Texas. And then down here it says, okay, when the state is Texas, let the capital equal Austin, let the largest city equal Houston, and then it returns that information back to the calling function. Return capital, largest city. And then it displays, right, this input by name displays largest city to largest city and capital to capital. So it's just displaying those values to our form. And one other thing to point out is that there's an additional action associated with our form called onActionCHTitle. So that gives the user the ability to change the title. So I'm going to pull this back over. Hope you can see it again. Right here's our action change title, or action view change title. When I click on that, the BDL program is prompting me to change the title. So I'm just going to type in my maps and click OK. And notice that that sent information about the title back to the web component. And the web component, in turn, used another GICAPI method to change the content of the title property for the web component to this value that I typed in called my maps. So that was a case of where the communication was going back the other way. The BDL program prompted me to put in a title, I typed it in, and then the BDL program sent that back to the web component, and the web component modified the HTML, the title for the HTML, and put it up on the screen. All right, so if I exit that, come back here. Let me see. Finally, there it is, right down here, GICAPI on properties. So that's that on property GICAPI method that we looked at earlier. I said not all web components have properties, so you wouldn't use this with all of them. But this one would have this title property. So when the BDL program passed in the title from the prompt to the user, this onProperty method was invoked, and it went out and found the title element for the web component and changed the inner HTML to this value passed in from the BDL program. So that's essentially how this guy works in a nutshell. All right. I think that'll probably do it for GICAPI web components. That's a simple example. There's also some additional examples in the application server demos, if you're familiar with those. If you look underneath the installation directory for the application server, the GAS directory, there's a demos directory under that. And then there's a variety of web component samples, including this one, that you can find out there and play with and experiment with to get familiar with them. All right, so I'm just going to check here and see if I've got any questions. Any questions about GICAPI web components before I turn it back over to Scott? All right, it doesn't look like I have any. Okay, Scott, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Excellent, thanks. That was nice. I learned a couple things as well about web components today. So that was thank you, Lisa, for coming and sharing your knowledge with us.